Since the dawn of history, man has yearned to fly. Yet it was the 20th century that has been witness to the realization of this, one of his oldest dreams. The island nation of Japan has, for much of its history, been shrouded in the mystery that surrounds the Far East. From the time of the Wright Brothers, Japanese aviators have lived and worked, as those in other nations have done, to further their dream of flight. Their individual stories have not always reached the West, and their achievements have not been recognized globally. But they have continued to work through good times and bad towards the perfection of the flying machine. The story of powered flight in Japan begins with a man who came close to achieving the dream some 10 years before the Wright Brothers' flight at Kitty Hawk. Chuhachi Ninomiya was born of a samurai family in the Hiroshima prefecture of southern Japan in 1866. As a young boy, Ninomiya was fascinated by kites and would make and sell them to supplement his family's income. While serving in the Imperial Army Medical Corps in the late 1880s, Ninomiya began to make sketches of crows in flight and went on to study the aerodynamics of other birds, fish and insects, noting how the designs of their bodies differed with the varying demands of their environments. Today, Hiroshi Ninomiya tends a shrine to aviation created by his grandfather, and now a place of pilgrimage for Japanese aviators.
In 1890, during a communal prayer, Chuhachi watched crows descending to eat the ceremonial rice and was fascinated by the way they moved their wings. On his way home, he thought of the way that the bird's feathers were fixed to the wings and decided to study this further. 2 years later, on April the 29th, 1892, he completed a wooden aeroplane in the form of a crow, the same that I now hold in my hands, and took it to the park at Warugami to test it. He wound the propeller, which was attached to a rubber band, and then released the model. The plane flew for a distance of about 10 meters. This experiment of Ninomiya's was the first flight of any aeroplane, model or full scale, in Japan.
After studying the flight of the lacewing insect, Ninomiya now produced his design for a full-sized aircraft, the Tamamushi.
Chuhachi made several attempts to achieve powered flight. He addressed himself to the army for help in the development of his aeroplane, but this help was denied. Nevertheless, he continued to study aerodynamics and to work towards building his aeroplane independently, until, that is, he heard that the Wright brothers had flown in America, and then he decided to abandon his own project. He still hoped that he could be involved in some way in developing aircraft, but in these early years, many fatal crashes occurred, and the need to remember these pioneers who lost their lives became more important to him than his own work. In 1912, he decided to dedicate himself to the opening of a shrine for aviators in this house in Iwata. He became a Shinto priest and held annual ceremonies of remembrance.
Ninomiya wondered whether his own aeroplane would have flown or not. It was, for him, his son and his grandson, a question that remained open. The Japanese military had initially placed its faith in the balloon rather than the aeroplane. By 1910, the Imperial Army and Navy accepted that the aeroplane was not going to go away and dispatched officers to Europe for training in the new machines. It was one of these officers, Captain Yoshitoshi Tokugawa, who returned in December 1910 to make the first ever powered ascent in Japan at the parade grounds in Tokyo. Soon, other aviators were entering the field. But by the beginning of the First World War, the Japanese Navy had a total strength of only 12 aircraft. Aboard the first Japanese seaplane tender, the Wakayama, Navy pilots sailed to engage the Germans in occupied China. Chikuhei Nakajima was a Navy lieutenant who'd been amongst those earliest officers sent to Europe to study aviation. On his return, he left the Navy to establish his own aviation works. Tsuro Torikai, historian and advisor to Fuji Aerospace Technology.
Initially, he tried to make airplane by himself.
Initially, he tried to make aeroplanes by himself, independent from government support.
Soon after that, government
But soon after that, the Japanese army supported him. Later, the Japanese Navy also supported him, so that Nakajima expanded the aircraft industry.
So gradually expanding.
The Nakajima Company became the largest company in Japan.
Becoming largest company in Japan.
Having built the Type 4 biplane for the Army, Nakajima went on to establish an engine plant that was to supply almost half of the aero engines fitted to Japanese aircraft. Immediately following the end of the First World War, and having learned of the success of the French airmen, the Army chose to invite the French Air Force to demonstrate their land-based planes. The Navy, on the other hand, had studied the British aviators and decided to invite a team of British officers to learn from their expertise in seaplanes. Seaplane building was to become a speciality of the Kawanishi family, who were, at the time, also one of the largest textile producers in Japan. Hajime Kawanishi, grandson of the founder.
When the aircraft manufacturing division of Kawanishi was established, Seibei Kawanishi placed my father, Ruzo, in charge of the aircraft plant. At the same time, Seibei recognized the importance of the technologies involved in aircraft manufacture and invited Dr. Theodor Karman, a German engineer, to work with the company and assist in establishing the necessary technical base. Dr. Karman supervised the construction and also developed the first wind tunnel in a commercial company in Japan.
While Ruzu Kawanishi continued to oversee Karman's work on aircraft construction and development, Seibei turned his attention to establishing the first commercial air transport company in Japan. Seaplane bases were constructed along the coast, and float planes used to transport mail between Osaka, Kyushu, and as far away as Manchuria. Orders for seaplanes for the Imperial Navy followed, and in the 1930s, that great era of the flying boat, Kawanishi was responsible for some of the finest designs in Japan. Their effectiveness would lead other nations to look to Japan for seaplane development decades later. But now, the growing importance of the aeroplane was not lost on the leadership of the day, and the names of Nakajima and Kawanishi, who had successfully gone their own way, were to rank amongst the main representatives of Japan's aviation industry. 1934, and the Nakajima aircraft factory has been prepared for a state visit by the Emperor Hirohito. Japanese expansion on the mainland had continued in 1933, and, undaunted by the League of Nations' censure on their policy of expansion, the worsening of relations with America, and agitation from activists at home, the army had seized the kingdom of Manchukuo. Negotiated by military men, and not their foreign ministry, a demilitarized zone and a tenuous truce with China was arranged. The military domination continued to prevail, and the Chinese provinces of Hopai and Chikuhei fell victim to the Japanese advances. The Imperial Army was well on its way to making China a Japanese protectorate. The Sino-Japanese conflict was by now increasing the size of military aircraft orders, and Nakajima, along with all the major aircraft companies, was able to expand greatly at this time. 3 years later, Prime Minister Konoye was to envisage the new order in East Asia, which would unite Japan, Korea, China, and Manchuria in an economic and political commonwealth dominated by Japan. The thinking was that a pan-Asian ideal could easily be expanded to engulf the colonies and states of the whole of Southeast Asia. The country was gearing itself for further expansion, and was prepared, eventually, to stop at nothing to achieve it. By the end of the decade, the new order was to become the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere. It was, perhaps, the most important period for Japanese aviation. Just as Germany was able to evaluate its machines in Spain during the Spanish Civil War, Japan was able to assess and modify from the lessons learned in the conflict with China. Military spending had been the backbone of Japan's aviation industry from the early years, and it had been difficult for individuals to establish themselves in aviation without the assistance of either the Army or Navy. The sheer costs involved in getting expertise and machines from Europe to Japan were enormous, but now the military funds were being diverted to Japan's own industry. As the Emperor Hirohito returned to his palace, Nakajima could be sure that the imperial government was well aware of the value of aviation in their plans, and was closely watching the progress of one of its principal players. But the 1930s was a time of aviation record-breaking for many countries, and Japan was no exception. From Kawanishi's long-distance mail planes to the Tokyo-London flight of 1937, Japan's engineers pushed the limits of their designs. Tokyo's daily newspaper promoted a non-stop flight to New York. A specially constructed Tachikawa Ki-77 was to attempt the feat in the spring of 1942. In December 1941, however, Japan's entry into the Second World War was to make any attempt impossible. Land and sea forces were prepared, and it was the Japanese naval air attack on Pearl Harbor that finally threw them headlong into conflict with the United States and its allies. Early on the morning of the 7th of December, Japanese carrier-based aircraft destroyed 8 battleships and 10 support vessels, along with nearly 200 American aircraft based at nearby airfields. The attack marked the entry of both countries into World War II, with Japan now allied with Germany. But Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor was only one of their offensives in the attempt to neutralize the existing powers that controlled East and Southeast Asia. The Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere that Japan had made plain a year earlier would be achieved now, not with diplomacy, but with force. Even as the attack on Pearl Harbor took place, Japanese forces were poised, ready to attack and occupy Burma, Hong Kong, Malaya, and the Philippines. As the news of the attack reached the Philippines' capital, Manila, a Japanese strike force had already set in motion its invasion plan. At the start of the Pacific War, the general assumption of the Western Allies was that the performance of Japanese combat aircraft would not match that of their own. It was to be a rude awakening. On the 8th of December, at 5:30 a.m. Philippines time, the Japanese attacked American bases throughout the country. From their air bases in Formosa, the Mitsubishis, Kawasaki's, and Nakajima bombers literally destroyed bases at Clark Field, Nichols, and Iba. On the jungle strips that characterized air operations in the Pacific, the rugged construction of these Kawasaki machines, their ability to operate in confined areas, and their attack and maneuverability capabilities gave the combined Japanese air forces an early advantage over their principally carrier-based adversaries. The American government was powerless to prevent the Japanese forces from invading the country. In 1940, the Mitsubishi design team had produced one of the most feared fighter planes of the war, the A6M, commonly known as the Zero. Although only operational as a daytime fighter, it was to establish itself as the dominant aircraft in the first few years, later to be eclipsed by Allied machines. The Kawasaki company produced the equally formidable Type Ki-61 fighter. In many ways far more versatile than the Zero, and often confused by observers as being one, the Ki-61, codenamed Tony by the Allies, was one of the most important aircraft used by the Japanese. Initially for home defense, it fast became a formidable opponent. Early successes had made the Japanese contemptuous of the Americans. Rear Admiral Hara Chuichi admitted after the war that they had become infected with victory disease and made the mistake of underrating the enemy. In addition, Japan's resources were gradually being depleted and were rapidly becoming inadequate for the manifold tasks that her strategy had imposed. The early successes were also due more to pilots and machines than to tactics. But there were successes that had not been won without costs. By April of 1942, it was estimated that Japan had lost a total of 855 naval planes alone, 315 in combat and 540 operationally. Exact figures were never published for its land-based aircraft, but the Imperial Army knew very well that the enormous economic and industrial capacity of the United States far outstripped their own abilities. In 1942, America's answer to the Japanese aerial superiority was unveiled in the shape of Boeing's B-29. But it too had its problems. Primarily, that the engines would only last an hour without burning up. It was engine failure that caused the second prototype to crash on the 18th of February 1943. It was then that the US Army Air Force decided to take over the program itself, and a B-29 special project was instigated, which encompassed not only production, but flight tests and crew training. It was intended that the newly activated 58th Bombardment Wing, operating under 20th Bomber Command, would begin operations against Japan from bases in China by December. By the beginning of 1944, only 97 had been built, and only 16 were flyable. Even so, on the 15th of June, the first B-29s bombed Japan, and the following day, Washington ordered Brigadier General Wolfe, its commander, to bomb the length and breadth of Japan. As the tide of war turned against the Japanese forces, conditions in the aircraft industry became more difficult. Mr. Shimizu was senior engineer at Kawanishi during the war years.
After 1943, the development of new aircraft designs proceeded very, very slowly. More and more design engineers were sent to the production lines because of the pressure to produce greater numbers of the existing aircraft models. As far as we at Kawanishi were concerned, our latest design, the Shidane, had completed the development stages and had already entered production at that time, so we were content to work on the assembly line.
Increasingly, the Japanese manufacturers were to find it impossible to keep pace with the mass production of machines in the United States. But the work of developing new designs was not entirely halted by the difficult conditions. The 1st of October 1944, the Kawasaki airfield at Hota. A Shinto priest blesses the latest product of the design team before its first flight. The Kawasaki G8 heavy bomber was the largest aircraft ever produced by the company and was intended for long-range missions. Although the tide of war was rapidly turning, the belief was one of total victory, which spurred on production. The lift-off is successful, and after a series of circuits of the airfield, the crew bring the G8 back to Earth. The test was a success. With its 4 powerful engines, a bombing range greater than anything previous was anticipated. But the aircraft had arrived too late to change the course of the war. Daily air raids by the US B-29 bombers were by now increasing in intensity. The US Air Force's decision in early 1945 to switch their bomb loads from high explosives to incendiaries was to wreak havoc in the crowded cities of traditional wooden houses. Amidst all this destruction, an extraordinary tale was unfolding. Japanese engineers, working towards the development of their jet engine, had obtained agreement from Hitler and his high command to exchange documents and plans with German aircraft builder Messerschmitt. The documents were placed aboard several submarines in Europe, and they began a long passage to Japan through oceans dominated by hostile navies. Fate dictated that only one submarine arrived at Singapore, and only half of the documents on board were sent ashore.
Mr. Nagamori,
Mr. Nahamori, Colonel Nahamori, a naval engineer, placed the documents in his briefcase and took an aircraft from Singapore to Tokyo. The rest of the documentation and the materials were still on board the submarines.
The rest of the documentation and the materials still lived on the submarine. But
the submarines which were to leave for Japan did not arrive. They were sunk at sea near Singapore.
Working in an old cigarette factory, with only half the intended drawings and under the constant threat of air raids, Dr. Osan Nagano pieced together the intended design and succeeded in building the first jet engine in Japan. To avoid the bombing, the airframe was constructed by Nakajima in a silkworm house, and by August 1945, the Kika experimental attack bomber was ready for its first flight. The similarity of the Japanese machine to the ME-262 was remarkable. The test was scheduled for the 7th of August and went ahead successfully. But at 8:15 a.m. the previous morning, a Boeing B-29 over Hiroshima had signaled the inevitable end of the Pacific War. Following the atomic bombing of Nagasaki, Japanese forces were instructed to lay down their arms, and a new government formed which formally surrendered on the 2nd of September. The terms of the surrender prohibited any development of aviation in Japan for a period of at least 7 years.
The small people rest in the aircraft industry, but the post-aircraft factory.
A small number of people were left in the aircraft industry.
They
They were making agricultural machinery, and also they were making pans and kettles out of the Japanese aircraft.
Japanese aircraft. And later someone the idea in
Later, someone had the idea of using a small tire from the aircraft to make scooters and bicycles.
Scooters.
Making scooters was a big job for the post-war aircraft industry.
Big job for the post-aircraft industries.
For the aerospace, I think that must have been one of the dark age. We cannot diversify because we stopped all of the activities for the aircraft. So those companies changed their business, say to automobile for machine production or something like that, not aircraft itself. But you see, aircraft engineers, they always look for aircraft, not others. So we have been kept waiting so long. And finally, 7 years later, in 1952, the ban was finally opened. But at that time, Japan took the strategy of two ways. One is to make the business healthier. That means we need a job. And that we started with the production of the U.S. forces T-33 and F-86 under U.S. assistance. And at the same time, Japan took another wheel, is to indigenously develop Japanese-owned aircraft and also Japanese-owned jet engines. In other words, so-called licensed production goes this way. And at the same time, we tried to enhance the state-of-the-art so that through the indigenous development, that's what we did. The first one was T1 jet trainer.
Ryozo Tsutsui had played a leading role in post-war Japanese military aviation development. When the first T1 was rolled out in December 1957, it marked not only the birth of an aeroplane, but the beginnings of post-war aviation production in Japan. Glistening in the rising sun, it must have seemed like the rebirth of a dream for the designers and engineers who had waited so long. But would it be successful? Designed partly from experience gained from licensed production of the American F-86 and T-33, the T-1 shared some systems and components with these aircraft for ease of manufacture. However, the dream of a Japanese-built engine was taking slightly longer to realize, and so the original T-1 flew with a British Bristol Orpheus power plant. A month later, on the 19th of January 1958, the T-1 was ready to take to the air for the first time. It was a momentous occasion and marked the beginning of a new age of aviation for Japan, which was to see them once more accepted into a world of rapidly expanding technology. For the designers and engineers, it was a long-awaited moment. Many of these men had wished to study aviation post-war, but had been prevented from doing so by the 7-year ban, which prohibited even lecturing on the subject in universities. Such men had been forced to glean what they could in private from the knowledge of older designers now working in other fields.
At that time, to find a job in the aircraft industry, so very hard.
At that time, to find a job in the aircraft industry was very, very hard. I was working with a bus body design team. My colleagues and my boss were from the aircraft industry in wartime, so they taught me some design and aircraft technology.
They taught me some design of aircraft technologies. So I took a job. Finally, I took a job in the heavy industry.
Finally, I took a job in Fuji Heavy Industries. It was very exciting, but also a very anxious time, not knowing whether I could do the job or not, because there were no lecturers in the universities. All the knowledge I had was self-taught or from the job training.
All my knowledge through my self-study and on-job training in bus body structures. So.
As the T-1 went into service, Japan's twin policy of rebuilding the industrial base through license production, while at the same time encouraging home-produced designs, continued to bear fruit.
We tried to get in the arena of the supersonic. The first one was the supersonic trainer, which is called T2. There were many objections, financially, technologically, that we Japanese engineers would not be able to develop the new supersonic airplane. There's so many objections, but we fought so much. And we got some money from the government, and we did it, and successfully. And then we improved that trainer into the first jet fighter.
The success of the F-1 led Japanese engineers to think of a purely Japanese-developed replacement, the FSX. But problems arose with the United States, whose preferred option was to work with Japan on an improved version of the American F-16.
And anyway, there have been so many debates, discussion, and finally, I guess that's rather politically that was decided to improve the current F-16 and not to develop from the scratch. That was one option, of course. And anyway, we did our best. And I always say that all of the projects in which I participated was success, except FSX. That is, FSX itself was a good plane. I mean, F2 is, of course, success. But that was different from what originally Japan wanted to build.
Despite disappointment over the cancelled FSX, the experience gained from licensed production was invaluable, and Japan pushed ahead with its own production of light aircraft, as well as re-establishing links with other aviation companies around the world. In the realm of helicopter development, this cooperation is particularly evident. As a country with more than its share of ocean boundary and mountain ranges with their severe weather, Japan has established a place at the forefront of helicopter manufacture. This has further reinforced their technological capabilities and ability to contribute to the international marketplace. With the development of the FBW, fly-by-wire experimental helicopter, Japan is now looking towards the next generation of machines. With the growing trend towards farming out the construction of aircraft parts to specialist companies, Japan has found itself well equipped to participate in joint ventures. Its ever-increasing experience of licensed production is now, in the 1990s, bearing fruit, with contracts to manufacture sub-assemblies for larger commercial aircraft designed in Europe and America. In the late 80s, the Boeing company had foreseen a need for another breed of long-range, high-capacity airliner and began development of the 777. Forming a special division to further the concept, in May 1991, they signed an agreement with Japanese manufacturers Mitsubishi, Fuji and Kawasaki to produce 20% of the 777 structure. The SST, successor to Concorde. Japan is collaborating on both engine and airframe studies to produce the next generation of high-speed passenger jet. To be economic, such an aircraft must be capable of carrying more passengers at higher speeds than ever before. The stresses on an SST airframe are immense. The technology necessary to investigate such a project is an area where Japan has now become a specialist. The search for more environmentally friendly aircraft engines has pointed to a new turbofan engine design. Conventional turbofan engines cannot currently deliver the thrust needed to take a large passenger jet to supersonic speeds. The new engines are capable of shifting from a turbojet to a ramjet mode. The costs of projects such as the SST are daunting, and with the increased competition in today's civil and military aircraft markets, Japanese companies recognize that the way forward cannot be forged alone.
The business environment would be more difficult and more difficult because the airplane itself would be more difficult to produce, to develop, and more expensive. That means, for instance, taking example of the future large transport that's bigger than, say, 747, the next one, or A3XX, next one, no single company would be able to develop and produce and sell for himself. We need worldwide structure or collaboration. And Japan would like to participate in one of the collaborators who has good technology, good engineering power, and can be respected. That's what I am aiming at.
In the future of hypersonic and space transport, Japan is consolidating its claim to be included amongst the world leaders with the HyFlex and HOPE projects. Along with these futuristic projects, the final years of the century have brought a sequel to the tale of Japan's earliest pioneer, Chuhachi Ninomiya. For almost 100 years, the question had lingered. Was his design sound? Would it have been capable of flight before the Wright Brothers if it had received the backing needed to construct it? In the 1990s, a group of students from a Tokyo technical college set out to answer these questions. On the centenary of Ninomiya's early experiments, the Tamamushi was rolled out for an attempt at flight. Taking to the air after 100 years, the dream of Japan's first pioneer. Towards the next century, Japanese aviation and its new pioneers continue the dream.
Top of the technologies all over the world, always. I think Japan is trying to reach that region always. So, next time would be the next century. The dream never die. That's what I can say.